The Edible Bean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Hensel Co-op.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to a new season of the Edible Bean School. To kick off 2024, we're going to take a look back at a 2023 season that delivered some extreme weather, but also some pretty good yields. We'll be joined later by Ontario edible bean specialist Meghan Moran to learn about what Ontario growers can take away from 2023. But first, we're going to head to Manitoba to talk with Manitoba Ag dry bean specialist Dennis Lange. Hi, Dennis. Hey, great to have you back on the Edible Bean School.
Yeah, great to be here again. It's that time of the year when we start to think about what we need to do for next year, or this year, I guess now.
Now, before we get into that, I must ask you about this shirt. I mean, we've seen a lot of color in the past, Dennis, but am I seeing cranberries here?
You are. This is something a bit different this year. I was on a website there before Christmas and found a site that allows you to take a photograph and upload it to the site and use that to make a shirt. And I was actually quite excited when I got this because I was just expecting it to kind of post individual pictures here and there, but it actually used the entire shirt or the entire picture for the shirt. So you got your sports in here, you got some nice looking crayons in here. So just something a little different to kind of shake the mix up a little bit. So,
awesome. Well, that's pretty cool. Hey, let's talk about the mix from 2023. In Manitoba, how did growers make out? We've heard about average to above average, but probably some variability in there.
Yeah, so if you look back, going back to 2022, we actually set a number of records for dry beans in Manitoba and soybeans as well. But in dry beans, we saw some pretty phenomenal yields. In 2023, a little bit of uncertainty during the summer because just based on dry conditions in the bean growing regions, growers were a little concerned about where the yields would actually be at. And when it was all said and done, most yields were above their provincial averages. So, when we were looking at pinto beans, we were looking in that 1,900 plus pound per acre range. So that's slightly above our five-year average in that 1,700 pound range. Mm-hmm. And navies were above their average as well in that 1,900 pound range. Blacks were around 17, 18 provincially. But generally, when we look at the overall numbers, there were some kidneys and crayons that were quite strong this year. Not as many acres, of course, but overall slightly above average and good quality. Even though we had some drier conditions during harvest, there were no major issues like cracked seed coats, and generally we've seen some pretty good quality. So I think for the most part, that's going to drive some interest going into the 2024 growing season.
Yeah. No, as I say, you say you're hopeful that bean acres will expand in the province this year. For that to happen, you'll need some new growers, Dennis. You say one of the critical decisions for new growers is field selection. Tell us why.
Well, and I think it's even not just new growers, it's existing growers, because whenever we see a bit of an expansion in acres, and we could be seeing upwards of 180 to 200,000 acres in Manitoba across all bean types, there are some concerns and some issues that growers need to be concerned with. And I think one of the biggest things is field selection. Back in time when I first started, we had a year where, everybody was growing dry beans in Manitoba. We had 310,000 acres, and dry beans were being planted on fields that were maybe a little on the heavy side. And then we experienced some major rain events. And I'm looking at I have a photograph here of a field that was navy beans on half the field, and on the other half were soybeans. And you can see where the dividing line is with the excess rain of 5 inches. So in areas that you have to be a bit more careful on where you're putting dry beans, you have to, again, look at good drainage, a little lighter soil, stay away from the heavy clays, save that for your soybeans. But along with that, one of the big things that I always encourage all growers to do when they're picking up either a new piece of ground or that they don't have a lot of history on, look at what chemistries they've used on that field in the past to make sure there's no residual issues that are going to affect your beans moving forward. Check the guide to crop protection. There's listings of a number of different products, the curtails being one of them in that group that can be a real problem for dry bean growers the following year. And just check those things, make sure there's no issues there. So
now, Dennis, more than likely, we're looking at drier planting conditions this year. In that case, you say growers really need to think about planting depth. What do they need to consider?
Well, the biggest thing that I get every year when we have a little bit of drier conditions is how deep can we plant our beans? Because growers want to plant down to 2 inches and sometimes even a little deeper. The problem with that is they don't grow like field peas. Field peas can push from depths of down to 2 to 3 inches and without any difficulty. With dry beans, ideally you want to be in that inch, in that inch and a quarter to inch and a half range is kind of the ideal depth. If you have to go a little bit deeper, the biggest thing is do that, go down to maybe an inch and 3/4, but only go as deep as you need to get moisture. That's probably the bigger issue. Planting it down to 2 inches, those dry beans are going to come up a lot slower. In our Manitoba soils, even planting mid-May, sometimes those soil conditions are still pretty cool. So if you're planting deeper, you're going to have to be prepared for a lot slower emergence. In those cases, you may want to adjust your seeding rate accordingly, and adjust it upward slightly to maybe compensate for potentially a higher loss. Or, waiting until you get that, May long weekend warmth that we generally try to see dry beans go in towards the end of May. Don't plant too early. Right. Growers in Manitoba don't typically like to plant that first week of May for dry beans. Usually try to wait till mid-May until we start getting some warmer soil. And, base your planting date on the amount of acres you need to get done. A grower planting 500 acres can afford to wait a little longer to plant into May, where a grower planting, 2,000-3,000 acres of beans may have to start planting into a little cooler soil, but spread the risk around a bit more.
So, Dennis, how does rotation impact this decision?
Well, the biggest thing I'd like to touch on is that if you're growing dry beans this year, one thing is to really look at what you planted 2 years ago. And in this case, I'm talking about soybeans. So if you had soybeans in year 1, wheat in year 2, and now going back to dry beans, that is not something I would recommend, because you would end up with a possibility of volunteer soybeans in your dry beans. That means you could also end up in the harvested sample. Because soybeans are considered a food allergen in the dry bean business, that could cause the product to be rejected at harvest time. And the worst I've seen was upwards of 9% volunteer soybeans in a dry bean. Again, that's an extreme number, but even 0.5% is too much. So keep those things in mind. Look at the rotation. Make sure there's no soybeans for at least 2 full growing seasons before you grow dry beans.
We are heading east now and welcome Ontario Ministry of Agriculture edible bean specialist Meghan Moran. Hi, Meghan. Thanks for dropping by.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Hey, now, Dennis shared the yield picture from Manitoba. What was the story here in Ontario in 2023?
Yeah, we had exceptional dry bean yields in Ontario this year, and I feel like I get to say this every year, but it's some of our best yields ever. So across market classes and in most regions, average to above average yields. So we had a bit of a dry start. Some growers got planted nice and early because the risk of frost had passed, which is great. Some had to wait for moisture, which didn't really come until all of a sudden a switch was flipped and we had like 8 inches in 2 days in some areas. So standing water and then higher risk of white mold, of course. So it was a grim picture, but ultimately really high quality beans because we had nice weather through harvest season, September and October, and really high yields, which really speaks to the varieties that we're growing and the experience and knowledge of our producers and agronomists.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that rain. There were questions about adding nitrogen later in the season. Did you see a lot of that with the rain? Any takeaways for 2024 if we see similar conditions?
Yeah, we get that question. It's a good one. You see the beans suffering, and we expect that any nitrogen would have leached out of the system when the soils are waterlogged. So should we help those plants out by adding nitrogen? And I talked to Scott Bales from MSU about this. He actually pointed me to an article that him and some colleagues wrote. And so, yeah, when you get waterlogged soils, the roots don't have access to oxygen, and some of those roots die off. And they're still respiring, but they're doing it a little bit differently. So you get these reactive oxygen species produced, and that's what causes the wilting and the leaf drop. And so, there's a couple things going on in terms of going in to add nitrogen. Can you add nitrogen? Like, is it dry enough to get out there? Because we did have continued wet conditions. Can we target those, smaller root systems, get the nitrogen where it needs to be and get it washed in? And can it even make use of that N? But, ultimately, beans don't really need nitrogen, and lots of research tells us that they make their own. And a lot of producers are putting nitrogen down, but ultimately we can have strong yields without it. And, I think it's safe to say that this year, the vast majority of producers did not add nitrogen after that scenario, and we had really exceptional yields. So we see root rot in those situations too, but I think, there's no clear benefit. There's no data on this specific scenario that says there's value in adding more nitrogen.
Let's talk about Adzuki beans. Big story in 2024. Some growers reported tremendous yields. But there were some challenges, including bacterial brown spot. What did you see there, and is there a concern for the upcoming season?
Yeah, so big year for Adzuki beans. We had around 25,000 acres, highest acreage yet. The price is really attractive, and so it's awesome that producers are able to kind of capitalize on that, and really strong yields. Provincial average in some regions was up to 2,400 pounds, which is a lot. So that means some growers have higher yields. Bacterial brown spots, it's not a fungus. We can't manage it with fungicides. Very similar to common bacterial blight, like in terms of symptoms. But it's kind of local, like you can find it on other host plants here in Ontario. Of course, starting with disease-free seed is important. When we have cool conditions and like lots of storms, hail, heavy rain, that's where we start to potentially see bacterial brown spot. And Adzukis are particularly susceptible. All market classes are susceptible, but so some producers in some areas had a lot of injury set in at the end of August really fast and kind of cut the top third or less off the yield. So it's not fun to see that, but similar conditions to 2014 when we had kind of the same problem. So it's really just weather dependent.
Yeah. Hey, a final thought from you on organic matter. You say it's so important to build and maintain organic matter, to help your soil, help the crop in extreme conditions, right?
Yeah, that's right. The better soil organic matter we have, those are good fields for growing beans on. And tillage is pretty common in dry beans, and I think that can make sense. But if we could try to move to some reduced till, or we are seeing some reduced till, especially in black beans, which is great. But even across the rotation, maybe reduce tillage to maintain organic matter. We're also growing other high biomass crops in the rotation. So beans are not adding a lot of plant material back to soil, but can we grow other crops that are doing that? Can we add cover crops and keep the soil covered through the winter? Because that organic matter will, hold water when we have those dry conditions like we did this spring, and magically it also improves infiltration when we have a lot of moisture. So in terms of being resilient in the long term, maintaining organic matter will be important.
Well, certainly lots to think about as we head into 2024. Thanks, Megan. I always appreciate you making some time for the Edible Bean School.
Yeah, of course, and look forward to seeing the rest of the episodes.